Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today we're tackling personal finance, but we're going beyond the usual spreadsheets and interest rates.
Yeah.
We're digging into the psychology behind our money choices.
Wow.
All those hidden forces that make us spend, save, or invest in certain ways.
Exactly. And our guide for this deep dive is Morgan Housel's brilliant book, The Psychology of Money.
Now, before you think this is going to be a dry lecture on behavioral economics, I promise it's anything but.
Oh, yeah.
Housel's writing is so engaging and insightful. It's like having a conversation with a wise friend who also happens to be a financial whiz.
I think what's so refreshing about Housel's approach is that he doesn't shy away from the messy realities of human behavior when it comes to money.
Yeah, he acknowledges that we're not always rational actors. We're driven by emotions, personal experiences, sometimes even plain old luck.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting, because once you start to understand the psychology behind money, you can start to make better decisions for yourself.
Okay, so let's dive into some of the key insights from the book. One of the first things that jumped out at me was how much our personal histories shape our financial outlook.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, imagine two people,
Right.
one who grew up during a period of hyperinflation and another who lived through an era of stable prices. Their entire financial DNA would be different.
It's true. They'd have completely different ideas about what feels risky, what's a good investment, how much they trust institutions.
Right. You hit the nail on the head.
Oh,
And Housel even talks about how John F. Kennedy's lack of personal experience with the Great Depression became a campaign issue during the 1960 election.
that's right. Apparently, his family's wealth actually grew during that time, so he didn't have that same visceral understanding of economic hardship as many other Americans.
Exactly. It just goes to show how deeply ingrained these experiences can be. And makes you wonder, can someone truly grasp the gravity of financial issues if they haven't lived through them firsthand?
That's a good question. I know for me, my grandparents who lived through the Depression were incredibly frugal, almost to a fault. It makes a lot more sense now, understanding where that mindset came from. But it also begs the question for our listeners, what pivotal financial moments have shaped your perspective? What experiences have influenced your relationship with money? Think about it for a second. It's worth reflecting on because those moments, even the subtle ones, often guide our financial choices without us even realizing it.
Absolutely. It's like a financial imprint from our past.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Housel talks about the immense popularity of lottery tickets, especially among lower-income households. I've always found that a bit puzzling.
It does seem paradoxical on the surface, doesn't it?
It does.
People struggling financially often spend a disproportionate amount on lottery tickets, even though the odds of winning are astronomically small.
Right.
We might look at that and think it's completely irrational, but
There's got to be more to the story, right?
yeah, exactly. It's not just about irrationality, it's about hope, maybe even desperation. For someone struggling to make ends meet, that tiny chance of a life-changing windfall can be incredibly compelling.
That's a perspective I hadn't fully considered before. It's easy to judge financial decisions that seem crazy to us, but as Housel points out, they often make perfect sense to the person making them given their unique circumstances. It reminds me of that saying, don't judge someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes.
Precisely. Empathy is crucial when trying to understand financial behavior. It's not always about right or wrong, but about understanding the context behind the choices people make. And sometimes those choices, even the seemingly irrational ones, can reveal a deeper truth about human nature.
Speaking of human nature, sometimes it's not so pretty. Housel dives into what he calls confessions, stories that expose the darker side of financial psychology. He uses the example of Rajat Gupta, the former head of McKinsey who got caught in an insider trading scandal. This was a man making millions, yet he risked it all for a little more.
It's a classic case of greed and the inability to stop moving the goalpost. It highlights how even the most successful people can fall prey to the allure of more, to the point where they jeopardize everything they've built. It's like that old saying, enough is never enough.
It really makes you wonder what was going through his mind. Housel actually quotes Gupta reflecting on his downfall. Don't get too attached to anything, your reputation, your accomplishments, or any of it. I think about it now, what does it matter? Such a stark perspective, isn't it?
It certainly is. It makes you pause and think about your own values.
Yeah.
What truly matters in the grand scheme of things? What are we willing to sacrifice for financial gain? These are questions we all need to grapple with. And Gupta's story, as unsettling as it is, provides a powerful lens through which to examine our own relationship with money and success.
Definitely. It highlights the psychological complexities at play, even among those at the top of their game. But speaking of the bigger picture, maybe it's time we zoom out a bit and explore the historical forces that shape our financial habits. What about this idea of American consumerism and how it influences our spending patterns?
It's wild to think how different things are now compared to
Hmm.
just a few generations ago. Like imagine waking up in 2020 after falling asleep in 1945. The economic landscape would be totally unrecognizable.
Yeah, talk about a culture shock. Everything's changed technology, the way we shop. It's a whole new world.
Exactly. Post-war, America had this crazy productivity boom and a surge in consumer spending,
Right.
fueled by low interest rates, government programs like the GI Bill, and everyone was just itching to buy stuff after years of wartime rationing.
It's like they flipped a switch from saving to spending.
Yeah, and that period really shaped the American consumer mindset. This idea that we should always be striving for bigger, better, newer.
So we're basically products of that historical moment, even if we weren't alive then. But the thing is, the economic winds have shifted since then. It's a different ball game now.
You're right.
Uh-huh.
What worked then doesn't necessarily apply today. Blindly following that old consumerist playbook might not be the smartest move.
It makes you wonder, are we still clinging to outdated habits that no longer serve us?
That's the million-dollar question. And it leads us to another fascinating concept that Housebowl brings up. The idea that tails drive everything.
Tails, like tails of a coin. I'm not sure I follow.
Well, think of it like the extreme ends of a bell curve. It's this idea that a small number of events, those outliers at the far ends, often account for the majority of the outcomes.
So you're saying a few key events, products, or decisions have an outsized impact, even if they seem insignificant at the time.
Exactly. And this applies to the stock market, business success, technological innovation, even historical events. Housel gives this interesting example from the art world. Great art dealers often built their collections not by picking individual masterpieces, but by buying in bulk, almost like an index fund approach to art.
Interesting. So instead of trying to predict the next Mona Lisa, they diversified their bets, increasing their chances of owning those few pieces that would eventually skyrocket in value.
Precisely. They embraced the randomness knowing they couldn't predict the future with certainty. And this same logic applies to investing. Most of us would be better off diversifying broadly rather than trying to pick individual stock winners, which is incredibly difficult even for professionals.
It's humbling to admit, but it's also kind of freeing. Takes the pressure off trying to outsmart the market.
That's the beauty of it. Once you accept the limits of prediction and embrace the power of tails, you can approach investing with more calm and patience. And this ties into another key concept from Housel. One of the most valuable dividends that money can pay is control over your time.
Okay, that one resonates with me. I think we all crave more time freedom. But how does that tie into investing and building wealth?
Well, Housel argues that the ability to do what you want, when you want, with who you want, for as long as you want, is the ultimate form of wealth. It's about having the freedom to shape your life on your own terms, not being beholden to a job or financial constraints.
I hear you. I remember when I was working a job I hated just for the paycheck. Zero control over my schedule, felt completely trapped. It was rough.
And that's exactly what Housel highlights. He talks about his own experience working as an investment banker, drawn to the high salary, but quickly realizing that those big paychecks came with a hefty price, a complete lack of control over his time.
So it's not just about the money, it's about what that money buys you in terms of freedom and flexibility.
Exactly. And he argues that while the U.S. has become incredibly wealthy as a nation, there's little evidence that people are happier today than they were in the 1950s when incomes were significantly lower.
That's fascinating. Why do you think that is?
Well, Hassel suggests that part of the reason is that we've used our greater wealth to buy more stuff, but at the same time, we've surrendered more control over our time. We're working longer hours, commuting further, and feeling more pressure to keep up with a certain lifestyle.
It's like we've traded freedom for fancy gadgets and bigger houses, and it hasn't necessarily made us happier. It's a good reminder to examine our priorities and make sure we're not sacrificing what truly matters.
Couldn't agree more. And this leads perfectly into another one of Housel's key points. Wealth is what you don't see.
Okay, now I'm really curious. What does he mean by that?
He's challenging this common perception that wealth is all about flashy cars, extravagant homes, designer clothes, those outward displays of affluence.
Right, the Instagram version of wealth.
Exactly. True wealth, according to Housel, is about the financial assets you've accumulated, the resources you have at your disposal, even if they're not on full display. It's about the freedom and security that comes from having a solid financial foundation, regardless of how many luxury items you own.
It's about having that financial cushion that allows you to sleep well at night, pursue your passions, and weather life's storms without panicking.
You got it. And Housel uses the example of Rihanna, who nearly went bankrupt after overspending. Her financial advisor, in response to a lawsuit, famously said, "Was it really necessary to tell her that if you spend money on things, you will end up with the things and not the money?"
Ouch. That's gotta sting. But it's a powerful reminder that spending even on things that bring us joy can erode our long-term financial security. It's about making conscious choices about how we use our money, recognizing that every dollar we spend is a choice we're making about our future selves.
Exactly. And this ties into another fascinating concept that Housel explores. Saving money is the gap between your ego and
Hmm.
your income.
I love that. It's so true. So many of our spending decisions are driven by ego, by that desire to impress others or to maintain a certain image.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And Housel argues that one of the most effective ways to boost your savings isn't necessarily to earn more money, but to tame your ego, to find contentment and satisfaction outside of material possessions and external validation.
It's about recognizing that true wealth and happiness come from within, not from the things we accumulate, which can be a tough lesson to learn in a world that's constantly telling us we need more, more, more.
It definitely goes against the grain, but it's a lesson that can pay huge dividends, both financially and emotionally. Housel talks about how people with enduring financial success, not necessarily those with the highest incomes, tend to have this remarkable ability to not give a damn what others think about their spending habits.
They're not trying to keep up with the Joneses. They're marching to the beat of their own drum, making financial decisions based on their own values and priorities, not on societal pressure.
Exactly. And that freedom from social comparison allows them to make choices that align with their long-term financial goals, even if those choices seem unconventional or even boring to others. Remember, wealth is often built in the shadows, not in the spotlight.
That's a great point. And it ties in perfectly with House's concept of embracing pretty reasonable financial decisions. He argues that we should strive for a level of decision making that is good enough rather than chasing those elusive, mathematically optimal strategies. It's like he's saying we should aim for good enough, not perfect.
Yes, exactly. It's about finding strategies that are good enough and, more importantly, that we can actually stick with over the long term. Even Harry Markowitz, the guy who won a Nobel Prize for his work on portfolio optimization,
Yeah.
admitted that he didn't follow his own complex formulas for his personal investments. He just split his money evenly between stocks and bonds.
Well, that's reassuring to hear. Even brilliant minds recognize that sometimes simple is best. It reminds me of another point Housel makes, that we should actually love our investments. That seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Like, shouldn't we be detached and objective?
It does go against conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
But he argues that when you have a genuine interest in the companies you invest in, you're more likely to ride out those inevitable market downturns and hold on for the long haul. Find that emotional connection that keeps you engaged even when the market is being, well, a bit dramatic.
So it's not about abandoning logic altogether, but about recognizing that a bit of passion can actually enhance our investment experience. I know for me, I'm definitely more likely to stick with an investment if I believe in what the company is doing and I'm excited about their future.
Exactly. And even Warren Buffett, the king of rational investing, admits to owning a few individual stocks, simply because he enjoys following those companies. There's something to be said for finding that sweet spot between your head and your heart when it comes to investing.
Okay, let's talk about risk for a second. It's a topic that can be a bit intimidating, especially for new investors. Housel makes this point that investing has a price. What does he mean by that?
He's challenging this idea that we can somehow achieve those high returns without accepting some level of risk and volatility. It's like trying to have your cake and eat it too.
Right. There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Exactly. Housel uses this great analogy. Imagine you're buying a car. You have three choices. Pay full price for a new one, find a cheaper used one, or steal it. Unfortunately, many people try to pull off the equivalent of grand theft auto in the investing world.
So they're chasing those high returns while desperately trying to avoid any bumps in the road.
Yeah, and it usually ends badly. Those who seek rewards without being willing to pay the price usually end up getting burned. Housel suggests that we view volatility as a fee, not a fine. It's the price we pay for the opportunity to participate in the market's long-term growth potential.
So it's about understanding that market downturns are an inevitable part of the game and even embracing them as the cost of admission to potentially higher returns.
Exactly. It's about shifting your perspective. And that leads us to another fascinating concept from Housel, the idea that investors often take cues from other investors who are playing a different game than they are.
Okay, this sounds interesting. Tell me more.
Imagine you're a long-term investor with a 20-year time horizon, but you're watching day traders making quick profits by jumping in and out of stocks. It's tempting to try and mimic their moves, even though their goals and strategies are completely different from yours.
Right, it's like comparing apples and oranges. You might end up making decisions that aren't in your best interest just because you're trying to keep up with someone who's playing a completely different game.
Exactly. And Housel points out that in the investing world, there's this pervasive belief that assets have one rational price, even though investors have vastly different goals and time horizons.
So what might seem like a reasonable price to a short-term trader could be totally irrational for a long-term investor like me.
Precisely. And this disconnect is often at the heart of bubbles and market manias. Take the dot-com bubble in the 1990s. A lot of investors were buying those high-flying tech stocks at seemingly insane valuations. But for those focused on short-term momentum, those prices made sense within their particular game.
So they were playing a high-risk, high-reward game, while long-term investors got caught holding the bag when the bubble burst.
You got it. Housel's point is that it's crucial to define your own investment game, your own goals, your own time horizon. And most importantly, avoid being swayed by the actions of those playing a different game.
It's about staying true to your own financial plan even when the market is tempting you to stray.
Exactly. It's about tuning out the noise and focusing on what truly matters to you.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've talked about the dangers of focusing too much on short-term gains and mimicking others. But what about the opposite end of the spectrum? What about being overly cautious or even pessimistic?
Right. Is there such a thing as being too risk-averse?
That's a great question.
Hmm.
Housel dives into this idea of pessimism and how negative outlooks often seem more credible and persuasive than optimistic ones, even if those negative predictions turn out to be wrong.
It's like we're hardwired to focus on the negative. When the stock market goes down, it's all over the news. But when it goes up, it's barely a blip on the radar.
Our brains are wired to prioritize potential threats and dangers, even if the overall trend is positive. It's a survival mechanism that's been baked into us over millennia. And unfortunately, that negativity bias can lead us to make poor financial decisions, especially when it comes to investing.
So we need to be aware of that bias and find ways to counteract it. Remind ourselves that things aren't always as bad as they seem, and that long-term trends often point in a positive direction, even if there are bumps along the way.
I agree. And that's a great transition to another important aspect of Housel's book, the power of narratives in shaping our financial decisions. He argues that the stories we tell ourselves about the economy, the markets, even our own financial lives, have a huge impact on our behavior.
It's not just about the numbers, it's about the meaning we attach to those numbers, and those stories can be incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. Think about the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah.
Before the crash, we were all caught up in this narrative about the stability of housing prices and the infallibility of Wall Street. But once that story fell apart, the whole system went into a tailspin.
It was a stark reminder that our beliefs and assumptions, even those seemingly grounded in logic, can be fragile. And those shifts in narrative can happen really quickly.
It's important to question the stories we're being told, seek out diverse perspectives, and be prepared for unexpected changes in the narratives that shape our world. We need to be critical thinkers, not just passive consumers of information.
I love that. Always question the narrative.
Hmm.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into the psychology of money, what are some key takeaways that listeners can apply to their own lives?
Well, I think one of the most important lessons from Housel's book is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to financial planning. The best plan is the one that gives you the confidence and peace of mind to stick with it over the long term. You know what he calls finding a plan that helps you sleep well at night.
I love that analogy. It's about finding that balance between risk and reward that aligns with your own tolerance for uncertainty.
And Housel has one final thought-provoking concept to leave you with. Nothing is as good or as bad as it seems. We tend to overestimate both the brilliance of success and the terribleness of failure without fully accounting for the rules of luck and randomness.
It's a good reminder to stay grounded. Success isn't always a result of pure skill, and failure isn't always a sign of incompetence. Sometimes it's just the roll of the dice, and life, like the markets, is full of surprises.
Embrace the messiness. Acknowledge the limits of your knowledge and find joy in the journey, even when it throws you a curveball. The true measure of success isn't just about the financial outcomes. It's about living a life that's both financially secure and personally fulfilling.
What an incredible deep dive. I feel like I have a whole new perspective on money and how it shapes our lives.
It's been a pleasure exploring these insights with you. And remember, the real work begins now as you apply these lessons to your own financial journey. What biases are you holding on to? What stories are you telling yourself about money? And most importantly, what steps can you take to create a financial life that aligns with your values, priorities, and aspirations?
Those are great questions to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the psychology of money. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep living a life that is rich in every sense of the word.